Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to be talking about the Mughal Empire. You will recall we started this in the last program, so I'd like to welcome our panelist guests again. Amjad Hussain Saab, welcome Amjad again.
Thank you, Dr. Saab, for having me on the program.
My pleasure. And Arif Ahmad Saab again, so welcome Arif.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Assalamu alaikum.
In the last program, we talked about how the foundations were laid for the great Mughal Empire, and we finished with Akbar the Great, clearly, who was probably the greatest Mughal emperor, and not just the greatest Mughal emperor, but probably one of the greatest emperors the world has ever seen. His achievements were truly enormous and recognized by world historians who've written, openly. His empire covered much of what we know of India and Pakistan, and he achieved some great things during his rule. He centralized the government and brought together many smaller kingdoms, delegated government, which I know Amjad we covered last time, and he was most of the Mughals were strong supporters of Persian art and culture. And also they were very tolerant of other religions, especially Akbar, as we covered in the last one. And he obviously had many wives, but one of his famous empresses, Joda,
Yes.
he married, and he had many other wives and concubines as well. But like all great emperors, they have to face their end, and in today's program, we're really going to talk about the remaining great Mughal emperors, starting off with Jangir, his eldest son. And Amjad, if you could tell us a little bit about when Jangir took over and a little bit of his early childhood and coming to power.
Sure. Of course, before we talk about Jahangir, I'll just say that Akbar the Great died in 1605, upon his death. He was succeeded by his son. He was who was known as Salim, then Mirza Nuruddin Beg Muhammad Salim, and he was known by his imperial name of Jahangir. Jahangir is a Persian word meaning conqueror of the world. And he basically came to the throne in 1605 until his death in 1627. His throne name was Jahangir, like I said, the conqueror of the world. And he was rather impatient for power because earlier on he revolted in 1599 while Akbar was engaged in the Deccan Wars. So Jahangir was defeated. The father, because he had immense support from the ladies of the house and the harem, and he was regarded as the favorite son.
In many ways, he was quite a spoiled son, wasn't he?
Yeah, very spoiled indeed. And he set the precedent of revolting against his father. That was subsequently followed by subsequent princes, and I think that was one of the low points of although they were great in their achievements and the monuments they founded, that they provide, they have left living legacy for the India subcontinent, and they changed it for the better, but they were down an ugly side to it, and one of them was brothers rebelling against their brothers and against their father. But nevertheless, Jahangir, he built on his father's foundation of excellent administration. His reign was characterized by political stability, strong economy, and massive cultural achievements. The imperial frontiers continued to move forward and expanded in Bengal, in Ahmednagar, and in the Deccans. And later during his rule, Jahangir was battling the rebellious son Khoram, and the rebellion of Khoram, much of Jahangir's attention was absorbed into that. So in the spring of 1623, he negotiated a diplomatic end to the conflict, and some of his sons were given important regional posts, as it were. So they were, so they remain occupied in regional disputes and in expanding the frontiers rather than basically threatening and their own father. Princes have nothing better to do. They'll feud against their father and be disruptive. So he put them in charge of various provinces. This was again negotiated by the ladies and of the harem, so there's always, they said, behind a great man there's always a great lady.
Yes.
And Mughals are great ladies, so to speak.
Yes, I mean, I know Asian or Indian culture has quite romantic notions of Salim and the movies around Anarkali and all the romances that went on in the Mughal court. And in many ways, though, it shows the kindness and magnanimous nature of Akbar, of how he forgave his son. But there was another side of Jahangir as well, wasn't it? The toleration, Arif.
Absolutely,
that he
particularly the religious tolerance. I mean, it's a fundamental Islamic principle. Many of our listeners will know that there is no compulsion in religion, particularly in Islam. And Jahangir, although obviously from a Muslim background, he was very insistent upon this point. He was, warned his nobles that they should not enforce Islam on anyone. And he wanted to enjoy, and did throughout nearly all of his reign, good relations with other religions. So, for example, the Hindu rulers, the dealings that he had with them, they were very good. This was something probably that he inherited from his father. His father sort of started this and saying that, if you have such a vast empire, you're going to have people from different backgrounds, different religions, and rather than trying to force them to convert to your point of view, why not understand them and tolerate them, and that way you'll have hopefully a more successful empire. So this was one of his very important principles, that he didn't force force Islam upon anyone, and he actually encouraged debate. So
I mean, he himself was quite a staunch Sunni, because I know Akbar had a lot more variation in his sort of belief
and
we
understanding.
talked about in the first program, but I think Jahangir was much more sort of staunch Sunni. But the great thing was he allowed Sunnis, Shias, and all of the faiths to openly discuss their religion.
Absolutely, to discuss the religion, and he also had people from different backgrounds in his governments or in his court. It wasn't that if you were a Sunni, you were the only ones that would be allowed to be in the court. I mean, having said that, like a lot of rulers, he did dabble in astrology, but this was something that was very common at the time. And there are some points of view that say that he was very liberal in terms of his religion, because he was very open with Christians. I think one or two Christians, because of his tolerance, I think they misperceived this. They thought that maybe he was actually an atheist at heart. So there are differing points of view about this. Some people think that he, because of his openness, actually maybe he was not a very religious person himself. But I think
the Jesuits in particular were given quite a lot of flexibility to openly discuss their religion in that part of the Muslim world, which is unheard of.
Previously unheard of, absolutely.
Unheard of, yes, that's right. The Jesuits are allowed to dispute publicly with Muslim theologians and to preach the gospel. And of course, this particular setting was frowned upon by many leading Muslim scholars of that time. They thought that they started to suspect his true beliefs, as Arif has alluded to. But I think he remained true at heart, a believer and a Sunni Muslim, but a pluralist one nevertheless, in the footsteps of his father Akbar the Great.
Yes, and I think this is carried on with his sense of justice as well. I think his stated aim was to start his reign with a grand display of justice. And he had some decrees which were based on liberalism and foresight. And one of his most famous principles was his chain of justice. This is sort of the link between the emperor and the subject. So the story that is said is that outside his castle in Agra, there was 60 bells, and anybody was capable of pulling the chain and having a personal hearing with Jahangir himself. So how many personal hearings he had, I don't actually know. But the principle was that there was a principle of justice, openness, tolerance, and if anybody felt aggrieved, they could request a personal audience with the emperor. Whether this was done just to keep people happy, whether this was done that there was, to actually look after his subjects, you can always debate it from a point of view, but the principle was there, that he very much believed in justice and wanted to fulfill that principle.
Amjad, there was another specific thing about Jahangir. He loved nature, and he was also a great admirer of the animals and so nature generally speaking. Do you want to?
Jangir was fascinated with very young age, and as a prince, budding prince, he was instructed in arts, crafts, and sciences and architecture, and he showed great interest in painting, and he was particularly instrumental in the synthesis of a new painting form, art form, which is basically called the Mughal painting of portraits and so on. And like you rightly said, he had a huge library and also kept a great number of animals. He had one of the biggest zoos, and not just for being fond of collecting animals. Actually, from scientific point of view, he collected many specimens of wildflowers, insects, and so on that he catalogued, and he organized experiments. And he was considered the patron of the arts and sciences. And due to his wife, who was of Persian descent, Noor Jahan, he basically he introduced the Persian form of architecture and Persian arts throughout India, and he was highly regarded. I mean, for his achievements in architecture and building. The Shalimar Gardens in Kashmir are well known, and the first seamless celestial globe was actually commissioned by him, and the Mughal scientist under his patronage produced the first celestial sphere that is called the seamless sphere. It's the first time that somebody actually managed to mold a sphere without a seam in it. You can't see that this is intricately and is regarded by. It's a move. Astrable, as that is well known within astronomy in the Muslim sciences, but it took the two-dimensional astrable into a spherical form, and it was the achievement that in trigonometry, and spherical trigonometry that has been missed by many.
Yeah, just one small point picking up about the art. I mean, I think the British Museum has actually a collection based on from the time of Jangir's reign, and one of the distinguishing features is actually portraits prior to his reign. Portraits of people head on, showing the face, they were very rare, and even after his reign. So this is something that maybe because of his love and appreciation of art, he actually introduced during his reign. So this is quite, a unique example of art that came during his reign. Because as people know, Muslims, maybe within the religion, portraits are not generally encouraged. But Jangir maybe had a slight deviation from, because of he would see it as his love of art and his appreciation of art, that he was happy for these types of portraits to be done.
Yeah, you touched on the Shalimar Gardens. I mean, Kashmir was one of the places he loved, and I remember in my young days when I was reading about the Mughals and how much he fell in love with Kashmir upon setting sight in Kashmir. And I think, I can't remember the exact verse or quote, but he says, if there was a paradise on earth, this is it. This is it.
To the effect, yes.
Something like that. And being a Kashmiri in origins, of course, I know what he's on about. It truly is one of the most wonderful places on earth. But it just showed that not only did he and the Mughals build these great mosques and castles, etc., that they admired nature as well. We touched briefly, Arif, also about his romantic side as well. But Noor Jahan, his wife, was a very, very powerful figure who had a great influence. Amjad, I think you mentioned about his wife and the influence he had.
Yes, he married into the Safavi court a Persian princess, Noor Jahan, and she remained influential throughout the court. And many people say that she was the real king or the empress behind the throne, and certainly she exercised a lot of power. But Shah Jahan wasn't with his, despite his tolerances and so on, he wasn't without his faults. I mean, there was much romance that's gathered around his name, particularly his illicit relationship when he was a young prince with a courtesan, Indian lady called Anarkali. That's been now widely adapted into literature.
Bollywood, yes, I think extended,
romanticized to something.
Romanticized, and like I said, he wasn't without his voices as as an emperor. He set precedents, like we mentioned before, of sons rebelling against their emperor fathers, and he was also much criticized and for his.
But talking of rebellious sons and talking about emperors really in loving memory of their wives. So let's move on to Shah Jahan, because he's famous for many of these things. And you mentioned earlier on, Amjad, his actual name was Khoram. Just take us through what's his full name, because these are titles that are given to these Mughals, aren't they?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when
but Khoram, when he was young, also
Yes.
he had battles with his father.
Yes,
but eventually, again, the ladies ganged up on Jangir as well, and they made sure that he was appointed.
So
as the
when
emperor.
Jangir died, Jangir was known as Salim, Mirza Nuruddin Muhammad Salim, and likewise he was succeeded by his son Khoram in 1627, and he was known as Mirza Shahabuddin Beg Muhammad Khan Shah Jahan. And
But
he
not
was
many
the-
people know those. You see, so
they had obviously imperial titles, and people is the imperial title that remains in the memory of people, that remains in history. But of course, they have their proper names too. And he was chosen successor to the throne after the death of his father. He was considered, of course, a great Mughal by his own right, and like you said, because he was also favorite of the concubines, and he was favorite of Shah Jahan, Nur Jahan, and of course.
I was going to say, I think one small point. I think his mother was actually a Hindu.
Oh, his mother was
yeah.
an Hindu.
So, although these are seen as great Muslim emperors, because of the expanding nature of the empire and the concubines and the wives, Shah Jahan's mother was actually a Hindu.
Oh, Shah Jahan's mother was actually
yeah,
Hindu.
yeah.
Yes, yes.
Jangir's was also was he the son of Joda Akbar or was it a different?
No, sorry, I don't quite because they had several mothers. Akbar married, he had several.
Because I
Sultan
know
Begum, I think
Jangir was definitely the.
Salma Sultan Begum. I'm not sure if that was Salma's mother. They were because yes, there were a number of ladies there. As I don't know, forgotten now.
Yeah. But when Shah Jahan came into power, there was obviously a lot of consolidation of sort of the Mughal Empire going on. They had continuous battles with other adjoining empires. But I suppose he really concentrated on the architectural achievements of the Mughal Empire, and the Taj Mahal was the prominent sort of feature that comes to us. There are other buildings like the Red Fort and Amjad. I know during his reign, quite a lot of architecture was made throughout the kingdom.
Yes, particularly as you mentioned, the Red Fort, also called Delhi Fort or Lal Killa in Urdu. There's a large section of the Agra Fort was expanded by him. The Jamia Masjid in Delhi, the Wazir Khan Mosque, the Moti Masjid, and the Shalimar Gardens, sections of the Lahore High Court. And there's Muhabbat Khan Mosque in Peshawar that was built by Shah Jahan. And there's also a mosque called the Shah Jahan Mosque, which is actually in Sindh. And I had the honor of visiting it, and it's a splendid piece of architecture. And it's, I think, still one of the largest mosques that has the highest number of domes. And they're known for their acoustic qualities, because if you are to utter any utterances and your voice is amplified, and it's a magnificent piece of architecture, and it's a very cool place as well because it traps the hot air, and in a sense it's very warm in it's summer. So I found peace in that mosque, and I have the honor of saying some prayers there too.
Mm-hmm. I suppose one of the most famous architecture is the Taj Mahal at Agra. And obviously most people, myself included, would believe that this was a tomb for his wife, Mumtaz. But I think there's a different perspective on this, which I'm sure is going to tell us about.
Well, that's the most popular, and it's become legendary that Taj Mahal was built in love for his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, and of course she was a magnificent lady in her own right, and a consort to Shah Jahan. Consort to the emperor. But of course, emperor being tutored in Islamic learning, and particularly the esoteric form of Islam, Tasawwuf, he was much inspired by the works of Sheikh Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, who's one of the prominent Andalusian Sufi, and he, in one of his books, had a vision in which he recorded he put to paper the heavenly abode of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or known as the Takht-e Mualla, or the throne of God in heaven. And Shah Jahan actually took the endeavor of putting that dream or vision of Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi in his vision into practice. And in the academic circle is well known. And actually, if you look at the copy of the Taj Mahal, it resembles exactly the drawing and the the copy of Taj Mahal is an exact copy of the vision of Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, which is recorded in his own book of the heavenly abode of the Lord. And Mughal emperors, they were dynastic emperors, and of course they always ruled through they needed to find some sort of legitimacy, and their legitimacy was ultimately that they were basically the vicegerents of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and vicegerents of the Prophet. All Muslim dynastic rulers, whatever form they were, oppressive or otherwise, they always wanted to find a worldly consent, and that was that we inherit the world as a transitory abode where the dominion of Allah lasts, and they said their kingdom was also the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Interestingly, I remember when I was in the younger days reading, the original plan, as I understand, was to have a white marble Taj Mahal on one side of the river, and across the river through a bridge, a black marble. But that never materialized.
And again, if you look at the Kaaba is black stone and is covered by the black cloth, and the Kaaba is always subdued in mourning. Is the color of black is of course as a subdued form, that is a color of reflection, and where we take our shoes off and we pray and we reflect on the harshness of life, and of course what life is. The great questions of who we are, what we are, the cycles of birth, and so on. And that's why the Hajis circumvented the Kaaba 7 times and so forth, carrying out rituals. And the Kaaba wears like I said, the cloak of the black. So Shah Jahan also wanted to build the white marble, and the Yin and Yang is basically to counterbalance it, that there is good and evil in earth.
Interesting thing is, I know I'm going to ask you, Arif, to sort of cover some of the governorship, because he was still a great administrator. And when you look at the timing when the Taj Mahal was built, that was similar timing to when the St. Paul's in the UK, in Britain, was being. So it goes to show the power and the architecture and the knowledge that was there in India and the wealth that was there to create something like that. But I think you were going to cover that.
Well, just to pick up on the point, obviously with all of this architecture and everything, there was still an empire to run. And I believe that under his time, the Mughal Empire had the highest gross domestic product in the whole world. So, wealth is required if you're going to make all of these things. But, there was an army of almost 1 million people. There was moderate increase in the size of the empire during his time. But there were also other setbacks. So, for example, an interesting episode is in 1630, there was a famine. Now, often when there is a famine, the subjects are very unhappy and depressed and down. And his response was to set up a langar or a soup kitchen for the victims. So he shows that there was compassion there, that it wasn't just about power and architecture and money. He was also prepared to look after his subjects as well. There was various things like rebellions, they had to be put down. So, for example, the Sikh rebellion, that was Guru Har Gobind. But also good relations and developing relations with the with other empires. So the Ottoman Empire, I believe that one of the sultans, Sultan Murad IV, he met Shah Jahan's ambassadors, and they exchanged gifts and exchanged pleasantries. And I think actually on the building of the Taj Mahal, the team, I think there were some Ottomans that were also involved in that as well. So it shows that these relations were being linked. Again, going back to the rebellions and fighting, Portuguese, they were actually based at their trading point in Port Hugli. And again, because of their presence, he wanted to get rid of them because of the trafficking that they were doing and the commercial competition. So obviously he wanted to protect his the empire's commercial interests and so in 1632 the Mughal Empire and the army defeated them. So there was always a balance, establishing good relationships with people that were like-minded and willing to work, but also eradicating and moving out people that were any sort of threat or any sort of competition. And again, this is part of running an empire and choosing to do the right things at the right time.
I think this was the stage also when the Portuguese and the European started having this exchange and interaction and seeing the greatness of the Mughal empires and also going beyond to China as well, isn't it?
Yes, of course. I mean, they saw the splendor and the wealth of India. India was actually one of the largest, as Arif has alluded to, one of the largest economies on the planet was in India. And obviously, in the sight of the Europeans, it was there to be molested, as it were, or taken advantage of, and they were shrewd and they were maritime powers. And of course, initially they arrived as trading partners and so on, and they were able to get the emperor to issue decrees, imperial decrees known as Farman in the trading favors, and of course there was much trade that began to happen, and of course later on they strengthened their foothold, and subsequently we knew what happened subsequently.
I mean, the interesting thing was when you look back, and we're going to go for a break, and in the second half we're going to talk about Aurangzeb and onwards. But you look at somebody like Akbar. He was he was illiterate, but he was one of the greatest rulers and one of the wisest rulers that you ever saw. But I think with his sons and grandsons, they were clearly much more educated because they had the formal education, as you mentioned. And they brought in some great cultural developments, which are from food to architecture.
Absolutely.
I mean, even to this day, when you look at Princess Diana and everybody else from the world, that picture in front of the Taj Mahal is...
They were truly multinational because they had exposure to other nations and so on. And like Arif alluded to, most of the artisans that came to build the Taj Mahal, they came from Persia, they came from the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and of course, not to forget the labor and the indigenous population. They greatly, there was enormous amount of engineering skills that they had.
Okay, well, let's have a break and then we will revisit the Mughal Empire and look at Aurangzeb and onwards. So welcome back to the second part of the Mughal Empire. Before we went for a break, we were talking about Shah Jahan and some of his achievements. And Shah Jahan also was blessed with a number of prominent sons, and he trained them well. Amjad, I think if you can take us through. He'd given his father a tough time with rebellions. So tell me how he fared with his sons. I think there are 4 prominent names and 4 sons, aren't there?
Yes, Dara Shukko was one of them, Shah Shuja, Murad, and Aurangzeb, and they were really all able, well-versed in arts and crafts. As being at least one of them being the heir apparent, another being, all of them contenders for the throne. They were well coached and counselled. Some of them excelled at very young age in military prowesses, and they established themselves as brave warriors. And the one who in particular that shone at very young age to be the brave was the future.
Aurangzeb was the one who became the emperor, but tell us a little bit about how the brothers interacted, because there's quite a lot being written and said about Dara as well, and how Aurangzeb and Dara sort of behaved with each other and what happened.
Yeah, sure. Aurangzeb was born in November 1618 in Gujarat. He was the 3rd son and the 6th child of Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. And after unsuccessful rebellion, as you mentioned, by his father, the then Shah Jahan against Mughal Emperor Akbar. The young Jangir, I beg your pardon. Jangir.
Yeah.
He was imprisoned. So the young child was imprisoned along with his mother by their grandfather, and of course, ultimately, the father then reconciled. Shah Jahan was reconciled, and then the young princes came to live with their grandparents and with their father at Agra. And Aurangzeb, in his very young age, he demonstrated his valor. There's an incident very early recorded that and an elephant, a large bull elephant, a war elephant, went berserk in the Mughal camp, and it basically went rampaging, and it caused a lot of death and carnage, and then ultimately charged at the camp of the young prince, and the young prince fought off the elephant, and later on he remarks that if the elephant fight had ended and wounded me fatally, it would not have been a matter of shame. Death drops the curtain even on emperors. It is no dishonor. The shame lay in what my brothers did.
This is Aurangzeb writing.
This is Aurangzeb writing as a young prince, because his brothers actually fled the scene and left him to mercy, and he was one of the younger brothers.
And I think at the time he was only about 15 or 16 years old, so it shows that this characteristic of bravery and valor was developed from a very young age.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, his father, the then emperor, had the young prince weighed in gold, and it is rumored or recorded that the gold and the gifts were weighed, and that recorded up to 200,000 rupees at that time. And this was actually event has been chronologized by the different historiographers, both in Persian and Urdu. And on this occasion, Aurangzeb happened to compile this and the couplet that I previously.
Many people say Shah Jahan's preference was for Dara, really, to groom him, train him to take over. But so, what's your thoughts? And the two differed in their outlook very much in life.
Of course, I mean, like Dara had his qualities. They all had excelled in. Dara excelled in diplomacy, in making alliances and so forth. He was of the intellectual type, well learned in arts, crafts, and he had also pluralist tendencies. Whereas the young Aurangzeb was also questioned councils and well versed in different sciences, arts and crafts, but he more excelled as a military commander from a very young age, and he was not too although he did have diplomacy. He pursued diplomacy when it suited him. He pursued war and cohesion when it suited him, but I think he was more of ultimately all empires are built on the battlefield, and Aurangzeb at very young age excelled, but of course there is a negative trait to him, which I think Arif is going to allude to, and which people have, history judges him by, that he was intolerant, that he was a tyrant and so forth.
But as you say, I mean, I think he took his appointments very seriously, and his father had actually moved him around quite considerably.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think from a very young age, as I said, the incident which Amjad talked about, he was only about 15 at that time. By the time he was about 17, his father already had sort of plans for him. I think when he was 17, he was in charge of the force that was sent to Bundelkhand, and this was about putting down a rebellion, and he successfully did that. Again, a year later, he was appointed the viceroy of Deccan in 1636. That's quite a young age, 18, to be a viceroy. And again, this was his Shah Jahan's confidence, you could say, that he was a great military and having some diplomatic skills, that this was the right person to lead that part of the empire. I suppose a turning point came in 1644 when his sister died. I think she was burnt to death because of some chemicals in the perfume, and this caused a little bit of a family crisis with some political consequences. The reason for that is that Aurangzeb didn't return to the father's court in Agra immediately, and this caused some displeasure with his father. So I think actually for a short time he was actually banned from court, but then he reconciled with Shah Jahan and he appointed him as a governor of Gujarat. So you see, he was moving around quite a lot and getting experiences in a way that maybe this honed his skills for later on, because it's good to meet different parts of your empire and try and see how different people are living. 2 years later after that, he moved from Gujarat to Balkh. And then I think a couple of years later, then he came back to Deccan again. So you see, there was a lot of moving around, even and there was a lot of jealousy as well, because sometimes Aurangzeb felt that he was being moved on unfairly or being sent to places which he was not worthy of, and why was he being sent there? So this is how the family rivalry is built up. We're going to talk about the war of succession.
Let's. I mean, that'd be an interesting time to move on. So when the succession came, or when he took over, it wasn't a natural succession because father ended up in jail. But to tell us what happened when Aurangzeb took over and how his tenure, emperorship started.
And I think the important point is that all when the father was aging and he was heavily intoxicated at times and so forth. Just to point to Korea, because this is a history program. Actually, the sister Jahara was badly scarred, but she did not die because of she was nursed back to health. But because all the chieftains and all the provincial governors paid homage and came to inquire about the well-being of the young prince, and she was quite handsome as well, and he was the last to inquire about her sister and held then ridiculed. But the reason it was is because he took his appointment more seriously than the health of the sister, whom we of course loved, although she had preference for the older Dara Shukko, but she also had a soft corner for Aurangzeb. Because he took his appointments very seriously, and he knew the decadence of his own family. There was much
the
involved.
Mughal court,
The
as
Mughal
with
court,
many other courts,
many other courts have
into,
their own failings, and they are not infallible. And I think because of that, he saw that his brothers were lackluster as they were not able administrators, although Dara Shukko was an able administrator, but whereas the younger ones, particularly Murad Baksh, who was once appointed as the governor of Balkan, and they were harassed, the Mughal, they was constantly harassed by the Uzbeks and the Turkmens. It was only when Aurangzeb was appointed that he managed to quell and hold the forces at bay. So he regarded his brothers to be incompetent and inferior military commanders. Although
so it was a sort of bloody coup, though,
it
against
was
Dara, I suspect.
Yes, of course. When the old man himself, Shah Jahan, was ailing, Aurangzeb took the opportunity and he made the first move against his father. He actually
imprisoned him.
Well, it wasn't quite an imprisonment people make it to be. It was
Home
more of a house
arrest,
yes, because the emperor still had the lavish.
He still looked after his father.
Well looked after. He never maltreated his father ever.
No,
he never hit him or anything like that. Never uttered anything against him in public, and was always polite, but nevertheless confined the old man to his quarters for his own good. So he says in his own writings, Aurangzeb then subsequently, they're all the brothers from different part of the country were marching on to the capital with
to
their
take
own
over.
to take over.
Yeah.
And what actually Aurangzeb did was he made temporary alliances with his younger brothers Murad and Shah Shuja, temporarily against Dara, to outwit Dara, as it were, and isolate him, and which he managed to do. Well, and subsequently, when he became emperor, he never kept his word, because originally he said to his brothers, "We will divide our father's kingdom, as it were. You keep your provinces and you become emperors and kings there."
It was that classic thing of making deals to advance your situation and then going back on those deals.
Going back on these deals, yes. And basically, this was.
So when did he actually take over then? His reign started, Aurangzeb's, which year was it?
1659, I think.
Yes,
1658, sorry, 1658.
Yeah, 1658. And of course, his father was still alive, and he kept some of his brothers in prison at that time. And then when he didn't want to basically eradicate them from the scene, as it were. No. That's too harsh. But he found convenience in Sharia. He found that because his father, one of his brother Dara Shukko, was liberal, he was dabbling with other faiths and other philosophies, as it were. And I
mean, Aurangzeb was quite a devout Sunni, and Arif, perhaps if you could take us through that phase, because that's when there was a significant change in the Mughal Empire.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, he used this pretext that Dara was not a good Muslim and executed on the grounds of apostasy. So this was in effect his biggest rival. And I think a year later, or a few months after he became the emperor in 1659, Dara was executed, and I suppose that was his way of getting rid of the competition and using that as an excuse to get rid of him. But yes, absolutely, throughout his reign, there was an abandonment of the pluralism that was seen in other under the other empires, and he had a much more rigid interpretation of Islam and Sharia, and he implemented that throughout his reign, and used the Sharia to suppress rebellion, and to for example, banning drinking, banning alcohol, banning gambling, banning music even. This obviously caused a lot of antagonism, but this was his way of exerting his power and influence. I think he was influenced heavily by the Hanafi school of thought, and he had lots of jurists and issuing fatwas and these sort of things, which he could then use to impose his law. And that was very much a characteristic of this establishment of what he believed to be Islamic law, that he wanted to stamp his mark on the empire.
I mean, he did a lot of work in producing copies of the Holy Quran and distributing them in a major way, didn't he?
Yes, of course. I mean, he used to himself transcribe the Quran and make a living out of that, and also make these religious skull caps that are worn at prayers. He will get his merchants to sell those in the bazaar and in markets and make a living out of that, because contrary to his predecessors, he regarded the treasury to be the trust to be held in trust for the common citizens of his kingdom. But nevertheless, he did squander much of his treasury on military expansions and conflicts and so forth.
Of course,
but just a bit of antidote to what Arif said, is an opinion that is well held by historians. But actually, many Hindu historians in modern India have come to the fact that although the sister and some of the courtiers and the ladies of the court, the Dara Shukla was favorite, but nevertheless his sister, who was again liberal and pluralistic like Dara, she basically interceded on many occasions on behalf of all the princes, and when she thought that Aurangzeb was more able and assert his authority, she interceded on his behalf too. And I think in ultimate result, it was the connection, powerful military connections that people had, and the military strength and capacity were the real arbitrators rather than philosophy or dogma, as it were. I don't think so. Of course, Dara was a lot more pluralistic and liberal in that sense of the world, but I think it was not his pluralism or liberalism that was actually, there were Hindus on his side as well as there were Hindus on Aurangzeb's side. So I think it was military allegiances and who had more chieftain and military commanders on their side, and ultimately military prowess that mattered really, that won the day for Aurangzeb.
One of the things is that in relation to Aurangzeb, a lot of historians and a lot of people have very differing views depending on whether it's from a Muslim perspective or Hindu-Sikh perspective. And in particular, from Sikh history point of view, Amjad, I know Aurangzeb is seen in negative light by many in the Sikh community, but take us through what happened and how this sort of interaction with the Sikhs and the Mughals and Aurangzeb in particular happened.
Well, as Dr. Sahab, as you know, the Sikh faith was founded by Baba Guru Nanak Ji Sahib, who was also held in high esteem by all Muslims, and that was.
And he was around a lot earlier than Aurangzeb.
Oh, a lot earlier, 100 years before, more or less. Baba Guru Nanak Ji lived around 1469, and he passed away in 1539. At the time of Aurangzeb, the Sikh community was led by the ninth Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, and obviously. He inherited a lot of the Sikh problem in his imperial legacy, Aurangzeb, and there were Sikh revolts during the time of Shah Jahan, which were ruthlessly put down, and so on. And,
even during Jangir's time,
Jangir's time,
and he also,
at the time of
Aurangzeb gets a lot.
Yeah, he gets a lot of them, and as being he regarded that as a descent. And I think, as you know, all emperors and kings are control freaks, and this is not belittling the tragedy that befell the Sikh community, because the central powers, whoever they may be, they regard any pretenders to the throne or any breakaways or any renegade sect to be a threat to their power, as it were. And remember, Aurangzeb was not tyrant because he was a Muslim. Let's not forget he started his persecution and intolerance against his own family first. He imprisoned his father under house arrest. He, of course, murdered his own brother, Dara Shukko, and also his other brothers. He exiled them and murdered them. And not just that, he also executed the Muslim mystics and Sufis like Sarmand Kashani was a very famous Sufi, and he was tried for heresy and executed. And similarly, the ninth Sikh Guru, Tagh Bahadur Sahib, was also executed for blasphemy. Remember, at that time, the Sikh community was regarded as a renegade Sufi group. They were regarded as an offshoot of Islam.
Because they tried to blend Hinduism and Islam
together.
And
of course, Sikh faith has been highly influenced by Muslim mystics, particularly Farid, Waris, Bulla Shah. So we find that Guru Granth Sahib has been compiled later by the Gurus. Majority of it is of the sayings, the poetic sayings of Muslim saints. So Aurangzeb, rightly or wrongly, regarded the Sikh to be a renegade and blasphemous group, or what basically was he was told of through the spies and various subedars, the head of the provinces. And he was not particularly cruel because here was a group. He regarded them more of a political threat. Any sect that was of political threat, no matter whether Muslim, Sikh or Hindu or any kind, they were harshly dealt with. This was the nature of the king as it was, unfortunately. But it's not that it was specifically because he was a Muslim and everybody else. Remember, he is part of the same Mughal household, and there was incidents of tolerance and intolerance. And of course, many of the claims against Aurangzeb, now even some of the Hindu historiographers regard that to be exaggerated. For instance, and there are extravagantly exaggerated claims that he desecrated or destroyed 60,000 temples. Now everybody accepts that no temples were ever touched. It's just that if his opponents took refuge in a temple, and in the warfare that ensued, that temple might have been desecrated. That temple was not targeted because it was a Hindu temple, specifically, just because his opponents. And remember that actually Aurangzeb's reign was strengthened by many of the Hindu generals, able-bodied generals. So they regarded Aurangzeb as a strong man, and they were with him because they were all equally chivalrous, and militant generals. And actually, there is now also research done that says that it was the Hindu generals who regarded Sikhs more of a threat to Hinduism than Aurangzeb regarded Sikhs as a threat to Islam, because after all, Baba Guru Nanak Ji Sahib is held in high esteem by the Muslims, and he is monotheist in his approach, because Hindus have several thousand deities, several hundred deities, whereas Baba Guru Nanak Ji believes in one Rab, one Lord. So
clearly there was a differing view across with the Hindus and the Muslims.
So it was not just Aurangzeb that regarded.
He had to take a large share of the blame.
Unfortunately, that being the case. But you'll see that he also was not stupid, and my good esteemed colleague here, Arif, will allude to that. He was capable and astute politician and a diplomat, and he made regional and international alliances.
I think one of the things we talked about earlier on was how he vastly expanded the Mughal Empire, and I suppose you're bound to get enmity at an increasing level when you're expanding an empire.
It's very hard to expand an empire peacefully, isn't it? So, almost throughout his reign, because of his background as a military person, he built up a massive army. There were periods where the empire had a lot of money, and this was able to fund the army. So all boundaries of the empire were pushed back, particularly in the north and the west and the south, to varying degrees of success. This was also tied in with the development of the military equipment as well. So throughout his reign, cannon-making skills were developed, iron forge welding and bronze casting technology. This enhanced the type of the weapons that he used, because again, most empires are always looking at the next weapon, and gun carriages and even the use of elephants as well. These were all advancements, you can say, under his rule, because obviously he wanted to protect and expand the empire. Even the infantry as well. There was an infantry called the sepoy, and they were very advanced in siege and artillery, because what tended to happen, the gist of what I understand in terms of how he expanded was, if there were governors or rulers who were not loyal to him, he would go there and exert, direct military control, or appoint somebody that was basically loyal to him. And so he needed a strong army, he needed a strong infantry that would be loyal to him, that could basically implement this policy. And so he needed all of these new techniques and to stay ahead of the game. But, generally, because the Mughal Empire expanded to its largest point.
I mean, I understand under his reign, it covered something like 4 million square kilometers, which is the second largest after the Maurya Empire of Ashoka the Great. So it was a massive expansion compared to his predecessors, which brought in. He also had interactions with other empires as well, and also with the European powers that were increasingly having their influence, didn't he?
Yeah, there was a few interesting points. I mean, for example, the relations with the English. So many of our listeners will have heard of the East India Company. But this was
started off as the Dutch East India Company, and then the British got into that.
Then the English East India Company. So in the late 1600s, 1686, they were basically after preferential trading rights, but they didn't do this in a very organised way. So in 1686, this actually ended in a disaster for them, because Aurangzeb dispatched a strong fleet. And they were basically crushed. It was later on, towards 1690, where they basically apologised, and I believe they even almost had to prostrate themselves and pay almost a fine. That's how they started to get their influence into India. So there was this interaction between the English East India Company requesting pardon from Aurangzeb, and him then obviously having better relationships with them.
And during Aurangzeb's rule, of course, there was always this continuing battle with the Marathas as well, Amjad, wasn't there? And Shivaji was one of their sort of big rulers.
A big warrior, Maratha warriors. He's known as the Great Maratha, but he was, from a Muslim point of view, a very evil man. And despicable things. Yeah. He murdered many Muslims in cold blood. Although by the Marathas he's held in high regard, and there are many legendary movies made about him. But one thing is obvious is that truce was ultimately agreed between Aurangzeb and the Great Maratha leader Shivaji, and Aurangzeb sent his beloved uncle Mamu to signed the treaty, a peace treaty with the Maratha war leader, and upon embracing the uncle of Aurangzeb, the Maratha pierced the heart of. He stabbed him with some say metal dagger, others say with his own nail that had a metal nail on it, and the elderly gentleman died. And that was a despicable thing to do in the middle of signing a truce and a treaty. He murdered Aurangzeb, and hence the hostilities started again. And of course, Aurangzeb died in Ahmednagar in February of 1707 at the age of 88, having outlived many of his children. And he was, to the best tradition and his deep devotion to Islamic beliefs, he was actually buried in a very simple grave in the courtyard of the shrine of a Sufi saint called Sheikh Burhanuddin Gharib, who was a disciple of Nizamuddin Awliya of Delhi. So Aurangzeb's son Bahadur Shah I succeeded him on his deathbed. And because of overexertion of Aurangzeb...
I mean, really, Aurangzeb was the last great Mughal emperor, and we had a whole series of emperors, but nobody of any really major standing. And really, it was down to Bahadur Shah Zafar, who was the last Mughal emperor, as I think we're approaching the end of the program, Amjad. So do you want to say a little bit about...
Mirza Abu Zafar Sirajuddin Muhammad Bahadur Shah Zafar is his full name, was the last of the great Mughal emperor. He was the second son and became successor on his father's death. His father was called Akbar II, and he used the Zafar as a poetic pen name.
Hardly the victor, really, but the British, the Europeans were making inroads. The Marathas had basically
devastated most
of the Mughal Empire. But there's a very interesting little poem from him.
Yes, he was only
he was imprisoned by the British. And
yes, of course.
Tell us a little bit about this point.
He was nominal emperor by name, who just his authority extended only to the gates of Delhi, and his authority was very limited. And there was a rebellion in 1857 led by the sepoys against the British rule.
The mutiny.
Known as the Indian Mutiny, or the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And of course, the emperor was regarded as complicit in that mutiny. He took refuge in Jangir's tomb. He was caught there and brought to trial, and he was exiled subsequently to Rangoon in present-day Burma. And on his defeat, he said, as long as there remains the scent of faith in the heart of our Ghazis, so long shall the talwar of Hindustan flush before the throne of London. In Urdu, the couplet is, he was an esteemed poet. Ghaziyon mein boo rahegi, jab tak iman ki, takht London tak chalegi, tag Hindustan ki.
Well, here we are in Britain, and no doubt Voice of Islam is all throughout London. I think we've reached the end of the program on the Mughal Empire. Amjad Saab, Arif Saab, thank you so much for your contributions. I hope listeners will have found this program informative. Please do give us any feedback through Twitter or email or Voice of Islam contacts that you pick up. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.